In the last video, we learned how to read from our Firebase database inside of a React application, and we learned how to properly handle loading and error states with React and these Firebase queries. What we're going to do is finish up our tour of the CRUD operations and look at create, update, and delete. And we're going to do the same process we did in the last video. We'll read the docs, we'll try and implement it just in JavaScript, and then we will move from JavaScript into React. And again, we're doing this so that we can isolate the concepts. If you can do this in JS, then your query logic is correct. And when you bring it over to React, any errors that pop up are because of the React logic that you're bringing into it. So let's start with create. And if we head back to our documentation here, creating data would be adding here under this add and manage data. And there is an add page, which talks about how you can put new data into your database. What I would encourage you to try doing is see if you can read this page and then create a JavaScript function, an asynchronous JavaScript function outside of React that puts a new user into your users collection. So I'm going to go through that now. I'm going to assume that you paused, gave yourself that challenge. It's important to go through that and try reading the documentation yourself. We can see here that there are a couple ways that we can add data into Cloud Firestore. So if we know the document identifier we want to use, we can just set that data. If we don't know what identifier we want to use for that document, we can ask Firestore to give us a new auto-generated ID in the process by adding. And we can also create an empty document with an automatic ID assigned and then put some data in there later. And you may do any of these three in your application depending on your needs. So remember that the examples here are running on this like data set of cities where each one is stored with like a 2 or 3 letter code as the ID, and then the data is in there. If you click on the test.firestore.js, that'll actually take you to the GitHub file where they're pulling this query, and these are all unit tests of the data set. And I think no, unfortunately, this is not as easy for someone who doesn't know data sets or no testing yet to parse, because you kind of have to look for where they're injecting these things into the database. But if you go back and go to our read data page, this will refresh you on that data. So each of the examples, here's the code, the identifier, and here's the data that's stored there. So what this example is showing you is if you want to just like override what's there, you can get a collection and then get a document using the ID for the document. And then you can just use the set command to drop this object in there. If there's data already there, this is going to override that data. So it'll essentially remove what's there and then put in something that has just name, state, and country. If there's no data, then it's just going to drop this into that location without overriding anything that's there. And there are options that you can pass in here when you're doing your set to, instead of override what's there, you can merge in your changes. So this is how you would do that first bullet point. You know the document ID, here it's LA, and I just want to set some stuff into that document. The second one, adding a new document with an auto-generated ID. If you fly down here, you get a reference to your, not this one, this one here. You get a reference to your collection, and then you call .add and you pass in an object, and it is going to go ahead and generate an automatically generated ID here, and then store this under that automatically generated ID. And we'll come back later and look at update, because this will be when we think about CRUD. After we get the create, we'll think about updating. That's on this page. So let's get a create running in our code. And I have the code pulled up from last time. I have my server running, and we were doing all of these demos here in our Firebase folder. And where we started was running these in index.js. So making sure that we could just do the JavaScript version without having to worry about the complications of React. So let's create an async. Oh, my typing is off. Function called create user, and we will take in a user object to this function. And this logic is asynchronous using promises, so we're going to use await and our try catch. And we, in our situation, don't want to do this setting of a document because we don't know the ID. If we look back at our database here, we don't have anything about the user that would make sense to use as the ID. Like, there are going to be multiple people named Rosa potentially in our application, so we don't want to store them under the key of their first name. And same thing with their last name. We might have multiple people with the same first and last name. So we actually want to do this auto-generated version to get data in here. So we're going to do the add method of our collection reference. So db.collection users add, and we're going to pass in this user object to insert it in there. And we can await this. And if we want to see what we get back from this add, then it is useful to pull up our docs here. So remember, you can get there if you go to the reference page. Let me close our previous tabs here. And then over on the sidebar, JavaScript, Cloud Firestore. And when we were doing the db.collection, we're getting a collection reference. And we were using the add method. And we can see that this takes in some data that you pass in and returns a promise that resolves to a document reference. And we can see that this is automatically assigning an ID to that document. So if we store this document reference, then we have access to the auto-generated ID. We know its full path in the database. We can ask to get all of the data from that location. If we wanted to set some new data, we could use this set method in here. So for the sake of being explicit with our variables, this is the document reference that we're getting back from the add method. We can console log successfully added new user at, and let's print out that doc reference ID so that we know what ID was just added into our database, and then we can catch any errors here with logging them using the error method. So let's create a user. And let's give this user a first name of Test and a last name of Mick Testerson. I am clearly not very creative today. And let's say that this user is not online and they have a high score of 0. And they are interested in the topic of movies. And actually, we'll throw books in here too. So this is just matching the format that we used for our users previously. First name, last name is online, high score, topics array. So the one thing that we're going to run into is that if I save this, this is going to hot reload in the browser potentially, which means that our user may get inserted as soon as I save it. And if I refresh the page a couple times, we're going to get that user added a couple of times. That's okay for our testing purposes. So I'm going to go ahead, save this. Looks like my hot reload is not working, so it didn't automatically kick in. So if I refresh the page, now I should see successfully added new user at GB6VE. And if I flip back to my console, we can see that GB6VE test, Testerson, high score is online, and our topics have been successfully stored as an array. Generally, this is going to similarly hot refresh. I'm kind of putting air quotes around that. But if you don't see data and you're pretty sure that you have successfully inserted something into here, just give your page a refresh. And if you want to delete data, so let's say I want to get rid of this person, when I have the document selected, I can delete that whole document here. And now it's removed from the user's collection. And if I wanted to remove the user's collection, I could do delete collection here, but that's going to clear everything from our database. I don't want to do that right now. Okay, so success, we did our JavaScript version. So thinking back to our workflow here, we understand the docs, we implement it in JS. Now let's implement it in React. So I'm going to cut this and create new user component, and let's paste this in, comment it out. Whoops, function, create new user, and we will export default, create new user. And same thing that I've done on previous ones, we just want to make sure that this is actually hooked up to our page correctly. So let's throw a div, and let's throw a create user header. And if we head back to our demos page where we've been putting these into our app, let's throw create new user. Make sure that it gets imported here. And it's showing up on our page. To make this a little bit easier to see, I think I'll reorder this. I want the create user to show up here, and let's throw the one that's the biggest, the get all users, at the bottom, so we can kind of ignore that. So create user, if we want to add a new user to our page and do it in this React way, we're going to need to collect something here and then have a button that is create user. So maybe we'll start off simply and we'll just have it where there's a first name and a last name input box and then a create button. So back in our page, we'll do first name, set first name, and use state here. And we'll do last name, set last name, similar state. And we're going to do our nested input inside of a label. So first name, colon, and we'll do a text input. So input text to use the Emmet expansion. We don't need the name or ID on this. Say the value is the first name, and the onChange is a function that takes the event and calls set first name on the event.target.value. And when I give that a save, Prettier is going to kick in and reformat this and add in our space as a JSX escaped space here. Let's do the same thing for last name. And if we have done this correctly and flip back, we should see the first name, last name, and let's throw our components panel open so that we can, whoops, not that one. Whoops, we just want this to highlight. There we go, create user. We can see those two pieces of state. And they are updating properly. So good to go. We just need our button here. That says create user. And maybe I want to break these out onto new lines. So I'm going to wrap my label here and this label here in a div and put my button in a div too. And again, we're not really trying to style any of this stuff. We just want to make sure the logic works. So I'm not worried about adding styling, but I do want to use a block level element, a div, to sort of group these on one line and group our button on a line below them. Obviously, the spacing doesn't look great, and our button styling doesn't look great with this form, but this is good enough. So then we can fire off our database query that we had set up here in an asynchronous handler. And I'm just bringing in our try catch. And let's make sure that we import DB here. Just hitting Control Space to get my IntelliSense to pop up. And then when we add a user, we want to specify the first name is equal to first name. So the field, this is the field name, this is the value, our variable. And so since they're the same thing, we can just say first name, last name, and then let's put in some defaults here because we're not collecting whether or not they're online. Let's assume that when we create a user, they're online. Let's give them a high score that defaults to 0, and let's give them a topics array that is empty. In a fuller version of this, we would capture each of these things in an input, maybe when they're going through the user flow. The high store, we probably wouldn't capture that, but like the topics array, we might like ask, what do you want to subscribe to, or like what kind of quizzes are you interested in kind of the user sign up flow. So we would probably capture that somewhere, but here we just want to understand how to add things to our database, so it's fine to just use the first name and last name. So let's hook up this on click to our button. So when we click create user, our state variables will be pulled in and a new user will be inserted with an automatically generated ID. And let's pull these side by side so that we can actually see this happening in real time. And there is a way, here it is at the bottom. I can collapse that for a little bit more screen real estate. So if we add testy, testerson, create the user, we can see that automatically got inserted here with our defaults of high score 0, they're online, they're empty topics array. And we should also see our console log here, successfully added that new user, and we're getting their ID. So that's update sorted for us, or sorry, that's create sorted for us. And what we would really want to do here is improve the user interface like we did with get all users and store whether or not it's loading, any error messages that occur, and display those on the page. For the purposes of just making sure that we get through all of the CRUD operations, let's omit that from the video and just know that we've done it before. We did it with get all users, we did it with get one user, so it's something that we should be able to do easily in this create new user. We'd store the state. When this kicks off, we'd say that it's loading. After we get some data back, we'd say it's no longer loading. And then here we'd be able to catch any errors and display those errors. So let's move on to updating. So I'm going to create an update user component. And return a div h3 update user. Export the update user function here. And put it onto our page. Let's throw it at the top so it's easy for us to find. Update user. Update user, looks good. So we are set up to restart our process of reading the docs, implementing in JS, implementing in React. And since we've done this process a couple of times, I would challenge you to pause the video and try reading the documentation here. So you go back to your add data page. The update a document section describes how to do that. See if you can implement it in JavaScript, then see if you can implement it in React. I'm going to assume you did that, and let's take a look together. So reading the docs here, we can see if we want to update a document without overriding the document, we can use the update method. So this allows us to do kind of partial updates to something that's already there. If we get a reference to a specific document in our collection, then we can flip the capital field to true without changing any of the other fields. And there are some more sections here about like, oh, if you have nested data, here's how you can update just the color from the favorites record in your database here. Or here's how you can update, down here. Here's how you can update elements that are inside of an array, or here's how you can increment a value without overriding the value. So in terms of updating, we have the ability to run the partial updates, or we actually have the ability that we saw previously that if you know the ID, you can blow away everything that's in there and set up the data for that user and remove anything that happened to be there before. So let's do the partial update version and just know that you've got that other option in the docs here. So we need to get a reference, a document reference. So talk to a collection, talk to a document, get a reference, and then call the update method, which gives us back a promise. So back to our index. Oh, you know what? Create a async function, update user. We need their user ID passed into us. So once we've got that, we can try catch. And in our try, we can talk to the database, get the collection reference for users, and then we can get the reference to our user document using the ID that we're given, and then update. And so here we can run a partial update, and let's say that we're going to update is online to be false for whatever user we're given here. And if we want to know, this is a promise, if we want to know what this returns, you can see that because the IntelliSense was able to parse our code and it has the documentation from Firestore, we can see that here, that it returns a promise with void, which means it doesn't actually give us any information. The promise doesn't pass you anything when it resolves. We could also find that same information if we went to the API reference and looked at the update method from the document reference. So since it's void, we could just await and say console log successfully updated user, and we will use the user ID here so that we can see. And to update a user, we need a user ID. Where did I put my, here we go. I moved it to another tab, so let's grab that back in here. Let's take testy and turn this user to online of false. So this should update just is online to false. If we supply the test user ID, give this a save, go to our React application, refresh this, successfully updated user with that ID. So we should see is online as false now. And we could flip any user to false by just getting their ID here. So we did our JS version, so we could bring this over to React now. Cut this from our file, go into update user, paste it in for reference. And to update a user, if we just think about the user interface really quickly, we'll probably want to do something, again, like the create user and get specific user. So we need a field for the user ID. And then we need some other field to control what we're updating. So maybe it'll be an update user where we're just like marking them online or offline. So we'll have the user ID input box here, and then we'll have a checkbox that indicates whether they're online or not. So we're going to need a user ID state variable. And let's import use state. And let's also get a is online, set is online. And we'll start that off as not checked. So same process that we've been using for quickly mocking things. Throw a label in there, user ID, and then an input of text. And we don't need name or ID for this input. We can just say that the value is the user ID, and the change is an anonymous arrow function that takes in the event and calls set user ID with the event.target.value. And let's copy and paste this. Is online question mark, and instead of an input of type text, this is an input of type checkbox. And the value you don't use for checkbox, we use the checked property, and we give it a Boolean. So if it's true, it's checked. If it's false, it's not checked. So we can just directly pass in is online here. And then when a checkbox is changed, you don't want the value, but you want e.target.checked. That will tell you true or false whether that checkbox is checked. And then we need a button. Update user. So if we've got this set up correctly, we should be able to check our state and see our state updating correctly. And actually, as I'm looking at this, I see an error. Let's pretend that we don't see this error so that we can use our dev tools here to debug it. So page stopped refreshing. So I'm going to force the refresh. I've got my user ID is online. And if I select this component, I can see my two pieces of state. If I type in something, it shows up in my state variable. Good. But this isn't working, and suddenly my user ID changed to true. So something has gone wrong. And that is, if I look back at my checkbox, I set my user ID to the target.checked. And what I want to do is set is online here. So now if I refresh this, type in a name, or actually this should be an ID. So let's not type in a name, type in an ID. And as I check is online, this is our state variable is updating over here. So we're set up in terms of our layout of our page and our React logic for the user interface. And now it is time to hook that up to our asynchronous logic to talk to the database and update this particular user. Let's change the ID to ID capitalize. And then we need to create an async function here. That does our previously established try catch. We need to import our database, and luckily, because we used the user ID variable in as a parameter here for update user, and we already have a user ID variable, local state variable here, we don't have to change anything in terms of these variables, but we do have to change is online to use our state variable. And since these are the name of the field is the same thing as our variable, we can just say is online without the colon. And this is small enough to fit on a single line. Let's get that function running. When we click on our button, and if we again pull this side by side with our database, refresh it, let's say we want Rosa to be flipped to online. So I'm going to grab Rosa's key and check this, update user. Rosa is now online, uncheck, update. Rosa is now offline. Let's grab me, grab my key in here. I'm online, so let's leave that unchecked. I'm offline. Let's check it, update user, we're back online. And importantly, none of these other fields changed when we did this update operation. Now, we haven't, again, handled the loading or error state for this so that we can kind of move quickly through these components. So if I do something like this and update user, there's no information here that something went wrong. And that's because we're dropping this into our console. So in the appropriately handled version of this, we would do our loading spinner and we would do our error message. And that logic would look very, very similar to our get specific user because it's the same flow. You're passing in some information, the query runs when you click a button. Same thing here, it's just there's some more information and the query is slightly different. Okay, so we did create an update. So if we look back at our roadmap, and I grab my tablet here, we can say that we did create and we did update. And so the last one we want to focus on is delete. And let me preemptively add a check mark next to it. And we'll go through the same process, read the docs, implement in JavaScript, implement in React. And same challenge, I would encourage you to pause the video, check out the docs, try to find how to delete a document, a specific user from a collection, try implementing it in JavaScript, try implementing it in React. So going back to our doc page And looking under Add and Manage Data, there is a delete data page that describes how to delete documents, fields, collections, delete data using the CLI, the command line tool, and delete data from the online console. So to delete a document, you just need to get a document reference, and then you can call the delete method, which gives you back a promise that will either resolve with nothing, letting you know that you successfully deleted, or throw an error. A really important note underneath here is that when you delete a document using this method, this does not automatically delete any sub-collections. So if your user document had a sub-collection for their quizzes that they completed, that had all of the scores for every playthrough of a quiz stored in it, when you delete the user, you wouldn't automatically delete that sub-collection. So you would need to do a more advanced kind of delete if you're using sub-collections here. We can see here's how you can delete a field. You call your update, and then you use this special value from the Firebase module, and you get that value from the delete function. Deleting collections is not something that is encouraged to do from the web client. You would have to loop over every document in the collection and run this delete, and each of those is a separate operation. So that goes against your kind of budget of reads and writes. So that's why they have that warning there. You probably want to do that from the server or from the CLI or from the Firebase console. And we saw previously that if you click on the users collection from the Firebase console, you can delete the collection. And if you click on a document, you can delete the document. And actually that restriction around deleting a document doesn't delete its sub-collections. That doesn't apply to the Firebase console. If you do an action like deleting this document, any sub-collections would be deleted along with it. So with all that context, let's just create a function that can delete a user given its specific ID. We will run that through just the JavaScript, and then we will bring that into React, where you get a little user interface like we have created before here, where you put in the user and then delete them. So let's start in index.js and create an asynchronous function, delete user, that takes in the user ID. And that deletes the user in a try catch. And if we look back at our docs here, up at the top for deleting a document, you need to get a reference to the document that you want to delete. So you need to use your collection ID and your document ID, and then use delete. And we can see from their example that delete is one of these promises that resolves to void, meaning it doesn't resolve to any particular value. It just resolves to let you know that that was a success. So we're not going to need to capture any value from our await. Just going to db.collection users.delete. Oops, not .doc. Pass in our user ID.delete. And then we can console log successfully deleted user. And let's turn this into a template string so that we can put in the user ID. Same deal as before. As soon as I saved this, if hot reloading is working, that user will be deleted immediately. So I'm going to hang on and wait to save this before... let's make sure that I've got... Let's grab testy. Drop this test user in here. Save this. And let's see. It doesn't look like hot reload happened here. Yeah, we're still seeing the error from the previous demo. So if I refresh this, successfully deleted user, that user is now gone. And if we try running it again, we should get an error because, oh, interesting. Well, that's shocking that the API here, when we called delete on something that didn't exist, it told us it successfully deleted. Good to know. So if we supply a key, let's try that with something else. Yeah, it is the delete operation tells us it worked when we give it a key that doesn't exist. Okay, we got delete here working. Let's cut that. Delete user.js and paste this in. Create our component for deleting a user. And return a div, delete user. And let's throw this component onto our demos page up at the top, delete user, letting IntelliSense import that for me. All right, that's on the page. So now we can start building it out. And really, it's going to be the same thing as our get specific user. So to speed things up, I'm going to go back to our get one user and grab this markup, the label and the button, and drop that in here. And we need our user ID, set user ID. And we also need our asynchronous onClick function. And these need to match because that's what we wrote in our previous component that we copied and pasted from. So then we drop in our try catch and make sure that we import the database, let Prettier format this for us. And we should have a component that can delete the user that we give it. So I'm going to create a new user. So that should have put a new user in here, Mike clone with those default values. And let's delete my clone by putting in that user ID. And that clone is gone. So we've got our delete working, and we've got our create so that we can kind of create these new users and delete them to test this functionality. I can see that I forgot to rename this button. Let's do that. So of course, these latest components don't have that loading, don't have that error state. So it would be good practice to go through and make sure that each of these is doing the query state type of thing that we're doing here. And in the future, we'll be able to pull this logic out into custom hooks so that we don't have to maintain this query state in every component that needs to get a user's information. We'll just have a hook that you can use. You pass in the ID, and it gives you back the data. So this should wrap up our tour of the fundamental operations of working with any kind of persistent data. You need to be able to create, read, update, delete that data. And of course, the documentation has a lot more pages here about the specifics of those operations. So checking out add and manage data and checking out read data as you're working will help you learn some of those nuances of like, oh, I wanted to make sure that I sort the data before I get it back, or I wanted to do real-time updates, or I want to batch some operations together to make sure that they all run in one operation. You can check out those pages as you're going. So now that we've finished our tour of working with Cloud Firestore from JavaScript, from React, now we can start focusing on actually taking our quiz platform that we were building and turning that into something that is using our Cloud Firestore. So these quizzes, we want to store them in a quizzes collection in Cloud Firestore. And when a user logs into our application and creates a new quiz using a form that we'll create, we want them to be able to save it to that collection. If they publish it, we want them to be able to go back into where that quiz is saved and mark it as published. And we want to have a place in our application where, you know, users can come even if they're not logged in and see all the quizzes and play some of them and check them out. So all of those features are coming soon. We'll do those in the next videos where we take our Firebase knowledge and take it back to our quiz platform, build out that quiz platform.